Thank you for joining us for the first of three conversations Edelman Global Advisory is hosting around the 2022 U.S. midterm elections. I'm your host and moderator today, Jeremy Thompson, president with Edelman Global Advisory, and have previously served as Kamala Harris's social media director during her historic presidential campaign and as a content creator for several organizations in sports, politics, and advocacy. The 2022 midterm elections are setting up to be an increasingly competitive one. If you had asked any of us 6 months ago if Democrats had any hope at all of hanging on to their slim congressional majorities in the U.S. House and the Senate, most of us would have said absolutely not. But a few things have changed. For one, Biden's approval rating has been slowly increasing over the past 4 months. But other numbers paint a bleak picture for Democrats. Consider the following. Edelman's trust barometer tells us a few things. Trust in government is the lowest it's been in several years, with more than half of Americans believing government is the dividing force in society. Nearly 2/3 worry they are being lied to by government leaders. All this data points to one thing, a course correction election, which means Democrats could potentially lose both the House and the Senate. Look, even though we've seen an approval rating uptick for President Joe Biden over these past few months, his approval ratings are still below 50%, which historically can signal a potential loss of over 43 seats. At least that's what history tells us. Look, the issues in this election cycle are also very familiar to us. Inflation and the economy have been the main drivers of our national conversation so far, and will continue to drive that conversation over the next 3 weeks. But we do know that other critical issues like education, abortion, the Supreme Court of the United States, and the future of our democracy are also driving turnout. So to discuss these key issues and more, two friends who are no stranger to the political space. Both of these people are veterans in our politics, and we're excited to chat with them today. First, we have Marty Reiser, Edelman Global Advisory Senior Advisor and Policy Director for Representative Steve Scalise when he was the House Majority Whip. And we have Andrea Hagels, Edelman's Managing Director for Social Issues Engagement and former Chief Communications Officer for former New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. Hello, you two. Welcome to the team.
Look, thank you.
Good to see you.
Let's just dive right in here for this conversation. Before I start, I think we want to talk about Dobbs versus Jackson. So earlier this year, the Supreme Court declared that abortions were no longer federally protected, which ended over 49 years of precedent from the Supreme Court. Voters have made it clear, especially Democrats, that since Dobbs, abortion is an extremely important issue for them this election cycle. Just the other day, President Biden held a rally to discuss this very issue. And he said, "Here is the promise I make to the American people. The first bill I will send to Congress after the election will be to codify Roe versus Wade." Andrea, is the president right? Did Dobbs change the political landscape that much? And if so, how might the midterms be impacted where people are actually voting right now on this issue and more?
Thank you. I think there's no doubt that Dobbs' decision changed the energy that was part of the midterms. I think prior to Dobbs, prior to the leak in May, the reality is that Democrats were not as engaged on midterm elections. And then when that decision came down, it did definitely give a jolt to the system. So you've seen women register in record numbers in key battleground states. You've seen the LGBTQ community come out in part because of Justice Thomas's concurrence. And, it certainly remains to be seen if it will be one of the issues that really drives people to the polls. But, based on what the Democrats are doing in battleground states, it's clear that they are using it as the key issue to define Republican extremism going into the midterms. I was in Wisconsin last week, and every campaign ad was about abortion, and whereas previously you would have never seen it at that sort of record level discussion. And so I think the more that you see Republicans use abortion too heading into the midterms, the more you're going to see this issue be a major driver. The fact that former Vice President Pence tweeted the other day in response to President Biden that, there is a goal to go state by state to create a national ban. That's going to fuel energy on the Democrat side. It's also going to probably fuel energy on the Republican side as well, heading into the midterms.
Yeah, certainly. And, when looking at the various debates of this midterm election, Democrats have been using some very familiar talking points. And Marty, I want to throw this over to you real quick. We're hearing about liberty, freedom, getting government out of my house. We're hearing those terms when it comes to the abortion discussion. We're also hearing those when it comes to the education conversation that's been happening around the nation. In Virginia, where I live, Glenn Youngkin successfully won his bid for governor by leveraging this very issue. Marty, it seems like this issue about education and the cultural issues are more than just test scores, right? It seems to be like a cultural conversation. I'm curious, Marty, how is this education and cultural conversation resonating with voters this fall?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, Jeremy. I look at this election in some ways as the COVID hangover election, and education was at the forefront of that. Parents were frustrated; their kids lost a year or so of education, and you go through a pandemic, we learn a lot of lessons, rightly or wrongly. It turns out remote learning doesn't work as well as in-person learning, and we all know that now. And a lot of parents were very, very frustrated through that entire process. I remember in February of 2021, we had a staffer came to us. She was a mother in Virginia, and she was part of a parents group. And she said, we should do a town hall meeting, a national town hall meeting. It was like, wow, that's kind of a big idea. Well, we did it in the middle of the afternoon with Steve Scalise, Virginia Fox, who's head of the head Republican on the Education Committee, and one other freshman member. And we got over 950 parents on the phone nationwide. And well more than half of them were actually Democrats. And they just poured out for 2.5 hours. Both members canceled the rest of their afternoon schedule because the meeting just kept going on, and talking about that. They knew the statistics on where their kids were learning or not learning. They knew the statistics of the cost benefit analysis of having them in the classroom versus at home in terms of the public health risks, and you could just hear the frustration. And we got off the call like, wow, we have something there, and this is going to be a big issue. And I think it still is. The pandemic affected everybody very personally and very differently. There were a lot of inequities that occurred, and one of those areas in particular was in education. Republicans have done a very good job of making that sort of a symbolic issue of a lot of other issues. And they've been driving that message home for 2 years. So I think it's going to have a fairly significant impact. And in particular, it impacts a key voting demographic, which are suburban moms, which obviously impacts off being impacted by the Dobbs decision. This way and is working, I think, more in the Republicans' favor at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And Glenn Youngkin last night held a rally in Arizona with Kari Lake. And during his 10-minute remarks on stage, he spent a lot of it talking about education, and was able to then pivot to talk about some of the other cultural issues that are happening. And, one of the issues we've been discussing over time throughout this year really is the future of the U.S. political system. We have seen some troubling numbers here. For the first time in recorded history, more Americans are going to the polls concerned about the future of the republic. A recent CBS YouGov poll says that 64% of Americans believe the U.S. will see an increase in political violence over the next few years, a figure that has actually risen slightly in the past few months. Look, we know voting rights, election security, the echoes of January 6th have driven that conversation. But also this morning, the New York Times pointed out that some people, when they respond to the future of the republic, are also thinking about things like the economy, inflation, and other indicators that might cause them to fear for the future of the U.S. and our government. Andrea, I want to put this question over to you because there's a lot happening here. Why is the future of American democracy on our list of issues for the 2022 midterm elections that we're paying attention to?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's really quite shocking for anybody who's been a student of politics to see that this is a fundamental question that is energizing voters on both sides of the aisle. The reality is there are certainly high numbers of candidates running, particularly in the Republican Party, that have rejected the election results and have campaigned on that issue. And you're seeing candidates like Kari Lake, for example, questioning the results of the 2020 election and saying that they would not have certified those results. Certainly, there are a number of candidates running for Secretary of States, which is a key position in states to determine the validity of elections. And so that, coupled with a declining support for the Supreme Court in the wake of what some have seen as increasingly partisan decisions, is really creating this moment of distrust in our institutions. And that's something that the Edelman Trust Barometer has shown previously, is that government is always the least trusted institutions that's there. I think it's really striking, for example, that election workers are being taught how to deal with violence on the day of the election. And the fact that they are being put in that sort of type of environment is shocking and sad, quite frankly. Certainly, you're going to see businesses, I think, in the remaining days, re-emphasize their provisions around voting, what time off they give to employees, particularly in states where you've seen increased, efforts to restrict the vote, for example. But it is a fundamental issue right now. And, I'm not quite sure that we have really fully taken stock of where this might be headed as well, given upcoming Supreme Court cases on voting coming down the pike.
For sure. And I think one of the important things here is, we saw over 370 candidates at one point who had rejected election results. And SCOTUS's approval rating is also rapidly declining as well. And I think when you talk about corporations really responding to this issue by looking at their PTO policies for voting, et cetera, I think, this issue is more than just a political issue, right? It's an issue that is an indicator of our society and how we're feeling about issues. Marty, when we think about companies who are really thinking about this next election, there have been some who have spoken out about certain issues. It appears that there are a lot of state legislators, like Texas and Florida, who have openly discussed punishing companies that go against core political issues that the state believes in. I'm curious, Marty, if you could give some advice, and what are some things that companies should be mindful of if Republicans are successful in taking the House or the Senate this fall?
Well, look, this is a tough issue. You point out their corporations are in a tough spot. America is a highly divided country right now. We're dealing with some very fundamentally controversial issues. We're dealing with them in a way that the system hasn't dealt with before, and by that I mean with social media and instant communication. A comment that a CEO makes is picked up and goes viral immediately in ways that it didn't do even 5-10 years ago. Yeah. And people are interested in hearing what the companies are saying. What I would say is it's coming from both sides, right? The political left probably started a little bit more of pressuring corporations. The right has certainly picked that up now and gotten quite effective at it. Both sides, it's almost cost-free for an activist group to beat up on a company and point out what they're saying on one side or the other. So this is going to continue, and companies need to understand their own values, be confident in them, and understand that whatever you say on one side is going to be heard by the other side. And it's going to be applied to the next issue. And I think the real danger, political danger that they get into with politicians on both sides of the aisle is hypocrisy. So if you point out one thing that's going wrong or policy that you don't like in America as a company, and you want to criticize leaders that believe in that, make sure that your policies in China are similar to that. Because if they're not, that's the real issue that the politician is going to narrow in on, focus on, and hurt the reputation of the company in that way in the eyes of the public. It is a tough issue because many of these companies are obviously large companies. Their employee bases are diverse and all over. Employees have different opinions. Some are more vocal than others. But it's important, you know your own values, articulate them, stick to them, and live with the consequences.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the key things that we're saying here is that as an organization, you should know who you are, and where your employees are, and kind of stay true to that core belief and value system there, which I think is pretty important, especially as we look at an environment that is constantly changing. I know over the summer, for example, it seemed every week SCOTUS had a new decision where we were eager to take an opinion forward against. And I think the next SCOTUS term might actually come up and might be just as divisive. Andrea, I'd love to talk to you about the next term. We know SCOTUS will tackle affirmative action. They're going to take another look at the Voting Rights Act. They're going to talk about civil rights. They're going to look at the independent state legislator theory. They're going to, really re-examine LGBTQ rights as well. Clarence Thomas hinted at that and more. I wonder if there's anything else organizations, companies need to be prepared for during the next Supreme Court term that you could shed some insight in.
Yeah, I mean, I think many companies breathed a sigh of relief starting in July, thinking that they had gotten through what at that point had been the most controversial Supreme Court session in decades, only to then turn around in October and realize, oh, we have to gear up again for all of these issues. As you mentioned, there's a big case happening at the end of this month around higher education and affirmative action, which then affects DEI commitments that companies have made in terms of the workforce. You are going to have a case around gay rights happening in December that looks at whether or not businesses can ultimately discriminate against gay individuals. And then certainly, as referenced, the voting case that many are questioning whether it's going to, fundamentally shift the way in which our elections are perceived and enacted. And so all of this to say that these issues, while they may seem like they're coming up rapidly, the reality is so much of this has been laid, the groundwork has been laid. And so from my perspective, it's really critical that businesses start to incorporate this in terms of their daily thinking, just understanding what is happening in your local community, understanding what your employees are thinking about and your customers as well, so that you're not caught off guard and you can start to formulate those points of view. Because to Marty's great point, there's absolutely no way you can walk down the middle and please both sides at this point. And so it's really important to start gathering that intel, because these issues are certainly coming at a rapid clip at this point and will only continue to do so post midterms.
Yeah, and I know our Edelman Trust Barometer data says that companies are actually the most trusted when we survey them among media and government. So they are in a pretty difficult position there.
Hey, Jeremy, can I make one quick point on some of the decisions that the court is making?
Of course.
Whether you agree with them or disagree with them, part of what's driving their philosophy is a belief that legislatures, not courts, should make more decisions. And so this is just going to add to the controversy on steroids. They're putting a lot of these, rightly or wrongly, they're putting a lot of these issues back into the political discourse. And they're very controversial issues, and we're going to be dealing with them in a political way rather than a judicial way moving forward for years to come.
For sure. And I think Moore versus Harper, where they're trying to have the legislator have the final say and say electoral issues, is an example of where the legislator is really trying to flex their muscle there. Marty, look, I know, we've talked about this sea change election. We've kind of talked about what would happen if Republicans were to take over the House or the Senate next year. I'm curious, what would the biggest watch out be if Democrats remained in the majority? And is there any insight you might be able to share there?
Well, I think first of all, there'll be a lot of surprised people, and in all seriousness, we may have a replay of 2020 on what happened in the election, people denying the results, and it could play, the feelings and events that led up to January 6th could come back in certain elements of the electorate or population. So that would obviously be difficult and bad. But I also think, depending on how this turns out, like there had been a sense that the Democrats had moved too far left, and that this is going to be a course correction election. If that doesn't turn out to be the case, and they move to 52 seats in the Senate and they keep the House, a whole bunch of these issues that didn't get done can suddenly get done. So, and that will certainly not make Republicans very happy, but you could see a very dramatically different agenda in Congress next year.
Yeah. And it seems to be that, right now we're still thinking we're going to see a House at least turn over to the Republican side of things.
Yeah, I do.
This fall. Yeah. Look, I know we've got some questions from the audience coming in, which we'll get to in just a moment. But I do want to just really give both of you an opportunity as two veteran communicators who have played politics and advocacy before. What is one key takeaway that our global audience should have, as we move into the 2022 election? If there's one thing we should be paying attention to, what should that be? Andrea, let's go ahead and start with you.
I'm going to answer it a little differently than sort of just from the political stance. I'm going to answer it from the work that I've been doing with companies, particularly global companies. And I would say that people sort of, particularly US-based companies, underestimate how much the rest of the world is watching what is happening in the United States and the ripple effect that these elections have. I mean, traditionally, midterm elections have been, yes, course correction elections, and they've also been ones with low turnout and low engagement in general. This year, I think you're going to see a difference around that. And that's in part because of the existential feelings that exist on both sides of the aisle around this election. And so there's going to be a ripple effect that you see as well. So in the weeks after the Dobbs decision came down, I was hearing more frequently actually from companies that had people based internationally who were saying that those were the individuals that were really concerned as well, because they recognized that the United States all of a sudden had such a monumental shift, and they were trying to make sense of it. And I know that there's been recent reporting that's come out as well saying that companies that are trying to recruit individuals that are based abroad to come and work in the US are finding it difficult, particularly in more red state areas, if they're used to more broader social policies than what they may be experiencing in some of these states. So I would just say that, while in the past politics has always been seen as a separate lane from business, I think the reality is it's only increasing right now, this merging of the two. And so it's really critical that you start to infuse it into your thinking.
Yeah, no, for sure. Marty, what about you? What is one thing you think that we should be paying attention to if you could choose something for this election cycle?
So, generally speaking, I'm an optimist, and I believe that voters make the right decisions in a global context or a 30,000-foot context. And so I think what people should be understanding is that the world has not gone mad. That we have very difficult issues. But the decisions the electorate are going to make are probably going to be pretty rational decisions based on what's going on in their lives. The pandemic has had a profound effect on our culture. It's had a profound effect on our economy. And, I know we're not talking about inflation today, but, whether the pandemic caused the inflation or policies caused the inflation, this is the first time Americans are going to the polls with inflation. And over half of American workers' income has gone down in the last 2 years. And that has a dramatic effect on their daily lives, whether that, it's being able to afford housing, whether buy a used car or fill up that gas tank. It has had a dramatic effect on their lives. And they've also seen, this is a 30-year trend of growing inequality in income. It's been exacerbated by the pandemic. People that have had to go to work and not been able to stay at home and work off their laptops, they're the ones who actually saw the biggest drops in their income. And so I think Republicans are going to do pretty darn well in this election. And I know there's a lot of other issues out there that, like, why is this happening? And people are concerned about the future of democracy. I do think people should have a little bit of confidence in the American people that some of these are going to be rational decisions, even if you don't agree with them.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that makes sense. And I think, Marty, some Democrats would love to share that optimism as they move into the fall this year. I know our audience has several questions for both of you, and we'll try to get to all of them. But, one of the first questions we have here is, it looks like we might have a Georgia Senate runoff on December 6th again. If so, Marty, does it look like where that's going to happen? And if it does happen, how could this month of uncertainty around who owns control of the House or Senate affect markets and business?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons we'd have a runoff, I was on another webinar with a company talking about the elections, and a libertarian sent a question saying, "Why are you only talking about Republicans and Democrats?" And in Georgia, that matters. There's a third-party candidate, and that's you have to get over 50% to avoid a runoff. And because there's going to be a third-party candidate, neither candidate may happen. Who knows? First of all, but a couple dynamics. If that runoff will determine the control of the Senate, it's going to be a very different dynamic than whether or not Republicans or Democrats have already wrapped up the control. And I heard one Senate Republican campaign operative explain to me if the control of the Senate is at stake, it will favor Republicans. Now it's the Republican view, but that being because Kemp's going to exceed Walker's margin. But if in the general election, and Kemp being the Republican governor at the top of the ticket, if then you get to a runoff and it matters about control, a lot of from a Republican standpoint, a lot of Walker's weaknesses will sort of be put aside, and they'll just be voting pure. Who's going to control Congress? So that would tend to benefit the Republican side. But who knows? At the end of the day, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and that is definitely a trend we saw in the last election with President Trump when he first ran for president. Right, a lot of voters were willing to put aside some of the issues because they were looking at the Supreme Court as a major issue there, which did help the overturn of Roe versus Wade. I know we have spent a lot of time talking about 2022, but I think our audience has a question about 2024. If we could indulge them for a second. What could the Democrat primary field look like, Andrea? And what is the likelihood of President Biden running for a second term?
I mean, all indication is that he intends to run for a second term, which I think will mean you'll have a more muted primary for sure. Names that continue to be floated, of course, the vice president's name, as well as Pete Buttigieg and others that have risen in the star power in the party. But I think, similar to what we were just talking about now, should Biden decide he's running for a second term, you're going to see Democrats coalesce pretty quickly around him, even those on the more progressive side.
Yeah, for sure. And, we haven't even finished the 2022 midterms yet. We're already looking forward and ahead. Marty, we've been discussing this election as a course correction. You've referred to in your comments that it seems like some voters have a feeling that Democrats have moved too far over to the left. If the Republicans take back the House, do you think Democrats might respond by rushing back to the middle? Or do you think we're in a circumstances where Democrats might just double down?
Yeah, I mean, the world it's a different world than I grew up in politically. I remember the republicans midterms when Republicans won for the first time in 40 years, and oh my God, the Clinton presidency was over. Republicans will walk into the White House in '96. Then they had triangulation became a term. The president moved to the middle, and he had a pretty simple re-election just 2 years later. Can that happen again? It can, but there are forces working against it. The bases of the party have become, and this is true on both the Democrat and Republican side, less tolerant of their leaders compromising with the opposition. It's really difficult. And neither party can win without their bases turning out. So it's become a very difficult situation for both parties to move to the center. And so, despite the fact that you look at polling, people think the Republican Party is too extreme and Biden moved too far left. Well, it's difficult structurally for them to change course because there are real downsides to their ability to get elected by doing so, ironically.
Yeah, for sure. I know one of the biggest debates that happen after any election, of course, is each part of the political party blaming each other for why they might have experienced a loss. Progressives will argue that we were too moderate. Moderates will argue that progressives were too far, and vice versa across the political spectrum. Andrea, one of the biggest things we've been talking about is a little bit of electoral uncertainty. So we don't know necessarily who will take over the House and the Senate as we move forward, or who might be president in 2024. But one thing that has been consistent over the past couple of years is that some businesses have spoken up about key issues about election integrity, about voting rights, for example. But we have seen that decrease just a little bit as we've moved into 2022. I'm curious, from your perspective and the work that you're doing, will we continue to see CEOs taking that leadership role and commenting on cultural issues? Is that something we should expect to see more of as we move into 2022 and 2024?
I think you're going to see pressure on CEOs to do more for sure. I mean, our trust data shows that pretty consistently, regardless of party. There's an expectation that businesses should be leading on societal issues, and that's both through words but also action around some of these key policies, whether that's climate change, racial justice, gender equity, and other topics. Look, the fact that we haven't seen CEOs speaking out as much recently, I think, is part fatigue from the volatility that we saw in the late spring, early summer around the Supreme Court, when you saw both, also beyond the decisions, mass shootings as well, and things like that. That said, I think there's going to be heightened pressure and intensity over the next 20 days, right, for the midterms, and then certainly beyond that as well. And so for those CEOs who may be thinking that they have now can just sort of focus on the business and not have to worry about these other conversations, I think that's a bit naive, and they should be assuming that they need to be at least learning about the topics and then getting engaged potentially.
Yeah, for sure. I know one thing that we discuss a lot is understanding that some of your biggest advocates and some of your biggest stakeholders are also your employee base. And so understanding them and where they are is very important during these conversations. We do have another question from the audience. And this is, Trump is always in the conversation, it seems. Is there any impact on this election cycle with the recent federal court ruling that Trump might have known his claims about the election results were false? Will it have any impact this season when it comes to this midterm election? Is this a big revelation? Marty, I'd love to throw it over to you.
So, look, Donald Trump is an issue in the election. One more thing that he did is probably not the determining factor as to what your opinion on Donald Trump. It's sort of more of the same. I think Donald Trump likes to be front and center. Democrats would like to make him front and center, and Republicans would like him to hang out in Mar-a-Lago until November 8th, as a general rule here. But look, his presidency was unlike any other. There are people that love him. There are people that hate him. He's one of the most controversial politicians in American history, and he's a potential 2024 candidate. However, having said all, so he's a factor. Having said all that, he's not on the ballot. And midterm elections historically tend to be referendum elections, not choice elections. Mm-hmm. He makes that historical analogy a little bit more complicated. But I think at the end of the day, it's certainly trending in this last month that this is turning out to be a referendum type election. Yeah, for sure. And I think Terry McAuliffe in Virginia might have learned the hard way that the former president, is not on the ballot during his elections. I'm thinking a lot that, for our friends who are, working in the C-suite of businesses or even working in various companies around the world and in the United States, listening, and really listening to these conversations, it seems like there's a lot up in the air, and they might be looking for some guidance on what to do. Andrea, I'd love to start with you. If a business came to you and said, okay, Andrea, how do I navigate this next election cycle? What advice would we give them?
I mean, I think it really comes back down to the company's purpose, its values, and its audiences. And so really sitting together and thinking through the factors that would lead you to engage on a topic or not. And, so much of that is your credibility in the space. So I always use gender as an example. You saw a number of companies send out nice tweets and statements for Women's History Month, only to be very swiftly ridiculed on social media because of their pay equity policies. And so that's an example of the fact that this, electorate, these, people are they're coming with receipts. They're checking to make sure you have actually done the work that you're, out there touting. And so I think that's the bigger conversation to be having. Whether or not you're weighing in on this policy or that policy is really less of the topic, and more about like looking internally to see what are you doing on these issues, and then thinking through if there's an external component.
Yeah. And Marty, what about you? Coming to you and ask, how do I navigate this as a company or an organization? What advice would you be giving out?
I agree with everything Andrea said. I mean, these are not easy things right now. Some companies have PACs, others don't. That in and of itself is controversial. And then if you do have a PAC, how you are allocating that is more controversial than ever before. Having good corporate governance around the PAC is really, really important, so that all elements within the company are represented, and the decisions are transparent are critical. Having very clear policies around turning out the vote, I think, is very, very important. But, each CEO they're individuals, men and women. They come from different political perspectives, and they need to have a sense for themselves. What do I need to say? Does anybody really need to know what I think about X candidate or Y candidate, or do they need to focus on issues rather than actual candidates, and try and stay out of the politics, but present their values within the political system? It's not easy. But it's inevitable. You're going to have to figure out a path forward.
Yeah, and it seems like the advice we would give, that we say to candidates and businesses all the time: authenticity matters. So at the end of the day, I think that is some really great advice there. Look, I want to thank all of you for joining our conversation today around the critical issues in the midterms election. I especially want to thank Andrea and Marty for this wonderful conversation. Really appreciate you being here. For all of you guys who are glued to the television for the next few weeks as the midterm elections rock on, you might have seen it this morning that a new poll has shown that 49% of voters said they plan to vote Republican in this news cycle. So with the inflation and economy top of mind, so please join us next week as we discuss one of the most critical issues facing the nation and the economy, which is inflation. That'll be Thursday, October 27th at noon. Look, don't forget to vote, everyone. And once again, thank you for joining. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Jeremy.